This is the School Success Podcast, a podcast for school leaders to learn from other school leaders what's working and what's not, and to get inspiration and encouragement, as well as strategies to grow school enrollment, connect with families, retain teachers, recruit teachers, and everything in between. You guys are heroes, and I cannot thank you enough for pouring into this next generation that's coming behind us. My goal is you will take at least one thing away from every episode that you can take back to your school to make it better than it is right now. Please enjoy the School Success Podcast. This episode is brought to you by our friends over at America's Christian Credit Union. This year, they're celebrating 65 years of service, and they're a credit union that specifically provides essential school banking services and an amazing tuition financing program for schools to reduce risk and administrative burden. You can check them out online, americaschristiancu.com/schools. That's americaschristiancu.com/schools. They are amazing. You need to go check them out. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey, school success makers. Welcome to another edition of the School Success Podcast. I'm your host, Mitchell Slater. I'm joined by a new friend out of Sarasota, Florida, Tim Seldin, who is the president of the Montessori Foundation. And those who have listened to past episodes and heard from me know that my wife and I, we love Montessori and that style of education. We've been doing it with our 3.5-year-old since the day he was born, just making sure that we were raising him up in that philosophy, in that way. And we absolutely love it. So being able to talk with Tim is going to be just absolute delight today because of what all he knows about Montessori for all his years of doing this, even though he's like 20 something years old. Well, we'll let him dive into that. He's been doing this for a while though, but I'm going to actually pass it off to him to introduce himself. So Tim, welcome to the podcast today, sir.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. My mother founded a Montessori school in Washington, D.C. in 1932. I grew up there, went through 12th grade. I swore I'd have nothing whatsoever to do with teaching or education and ended up sucked in and discovered that it was a much happier life and a much better way to make a difference in the world.
Love it, man. Well, tell me, well, even before we dive in, because I always have to ask this question. So you live in Sarasota, and I live in Florida. Obviously, we're a few hours away. If I was to ever visit Sarasota, what would you say, or anybody visit Sarasota, you would say you got to do this to really experience Sarasota, Florida?
Well, you've got to go to St. Armand Circle. You've got to go to Siesta Key. You ought to go to Lido Key. They're all wonderful. And of course, downtown Sarasota is charming and cute. And if you're a Montessori fan, you call up the Newgate School, which is our lab school, go from infants through high school, and we welcome people from around the world.
Love it. Awesome. Well, as we dive in today, of course, our audience is school leaders from all over, predominantly the United States. And so those that are listening that maybe aren't super familiar with what Montessori is, maybe heard the word, all that stuff, I would love you to kind of just share in your own words what all that is, so we can kind of create a basis, and then we can kind of expound on that for today's interview.
Oh, wow. Montessori is many things. I talk a lot about the Montessori way. Montessori is a way of organizing organizations, families, classrooms, schools. I would like to suggest it's a way we ought to organize civic life and government and states and countries and international relations. So it's a lot of things to different people. It's the name of a person, Dr. Maria Montessori. It's a philosophy of education. It's a way of relating to people. From the education point of view, most people know it as early childhood education, and I think that's where it stops. And that's because the first 6 years of life are, in pretty much everyone's understanding today, the most important period in human development. And so everyone, a parent is not necessarily a professional educator, but they are a child's first educator and the most influential educator in most situations. They're lifelong teachers, if you will. Children don't just learn from teachers or from textbooks or from classes. They're learning all the time. And my little dog here is reminding me that one of the things we try to do in Montessori is create a safe place, a place where children feel seen, feel heard, are able to to follow their interests, which doesn't mean it's free range and do whatever you want. It's anything that's good and positive and appropriate. But it recognizes that it's silly to imagine that just because you're giving a lesson to 20 kids, that all 20 kids are ready for the lesson and are going to learn it equally well. And that's why we use the word graduation. We put kids in rank order. And the old saying is, what do you call the person who's the lowest in their class in medical school? What are they called? The answer is doctor. And the idea of competing as a way of trying to motivate people to learn is really silly, because learning is hardwired into human beings and truthfully all living things. They learn from their environment. They learn from experience. And human beings are capable of amazing things. We're all different. Some of us are natural athletes. We're natural musicians. We're dancers. We're agile. We're clumsy, whatever. But the more people are exposed to stimulus, to opportunities, to encouragement, to a safe, stimulating environment in the first 6 years of life, the more likely the brain is to develop the pathways that lead to further lifelong learning. So I wrote a book called How to Raise an Amazing Child. And the point is, children are all unique. Each one of them a universe of one. Schools ought to be designed around the child instead of making the child fit the program the school has in mind. Mm-hmm. That's another confusion about Montessori, that Montessori is one thing and one thing only. Wrong, it's not a cookbook. It's designed to follow the child and to allow the child to reveal herself to us in a safe place where she feels safe, feels heard, feels seen, and we help them learn how to do things for themselves.
Man, obviously I love that, and I've seen how my son, or my wife and I's son, has thrived with that environment or that style. Not saying that, kids can't thrive in other environments and styles, of course, but like just seeing him work with it, and it just really fit with, it made sense. When we heard about different things of how you would do certain pieces of play and like let him learn through play, which I know I did that growing up, man. I climbed trees. I figured out just games out of nothing in the backyard, and just seeing him, like, the imagination start kicking in now as he's going to turn 4 later this year, and it's just really cool. And so, like, we set out his toys in his playroom, like one couple toys on a shelf, and then we rotate them, and just it's very it's not chaotic, I guess. I know I'll see sometimes where there's just like stuff everywhere, but it's very thought out. Like, my wife does an amazing job of learning, just diving into the Montessori style and having everything set up for him. But if, for those that are listening, I mean, we talk about the 0 to 6, which obviously is extremely important, and for brain development and all of that. So if schools are listening, if there's something that they could do, if they have like a pre-K program, because, depending on how many we have listening that aren't doing like preschool things, is there something you would tell a school that's maybe not a Montessori school? Like, is there some things that come to mind saying, hey, I would love to see schools implement this, whether it's 0 to 6 or even beyond that would be really beneficial to them and their students?
Oh my goodness, there's so much to it. I mean, the bottom line is, whether you call it Montessori or not, what works around the world. And that's really the shocker. Human beings are genetically hardwired to learn. And a well-designed school is designed for differences. Children want to be independent. They're just hardwired. They're in we call sensitive periods to develop language, to learn how to move, to be independent. And they want to do it for themselves, unless you deliberately go in there and screw around with them and get them to feel afraid or ashamed or not good enough. In other words, you can cause a child to become very hesitant. But they're normally born with curiosity, imagination, creativity. They don't need lessons in that. They're hardwired for it. What we want to do is prepare an environment. I think that most of what I see being done with young children is thought of as preschool or childcare, and I think that's an incredible waste of human potential. Children are capable of amazing things. Teachers usually get more pay and more respect the older the students are they teach. And unfortunately, the people who work with very young children are often not given the respect, the credibility, or the pay that they really deserve, because people assume that because they're not doing calculus, that it's really not very hard to teach them. But it's actually very hard to teach them. You need to break the cycle of adult domination. You need to learn how to help them to become independent, to develop what Duckworth calls executive function skills, to be very capable of persevering, of making choices, of not being distracted, developing a rich vocabulary, and of recognizing that their own curiosity and their interests have value, that they're not just doing what they're told. So there's, dog training where you're basically giving dogs a treat and they're learning to beg for food, as opposed to developing a working partnership with a human being that's another stage of life than you are, kind of like a caterpillar eventually becomes a butterfly, or a tadpole becomes an adult frog. It's just a different stage of the same species at a different stage of their life. And if you really understand how the brain develops, and you design schools to meet them, and you create a safe, loving environment, I don't care whether you call it Montessori or something else, it's not going to be about you and your lessons. It's going to be about you engineering an environment that's safe and stimulating. It's preparing yourself to know how to do no harm, to empower them, to hear them, to move at a pace that they understand, because we typically get frustrated with kids because they get distracted by an ant or a butterfly or something they see, and we just don't understand. We're trying to get out of the house, and they're just being who they are. So if you follow the child and you really try to design a school that works with them instead of fighting human nature, it's kind of like trying to swim uphill against the current of a river. It's a losing proposition unless you got a motorboat. If you want to swim manually across a river, you don't even swim straight across, because the current's going to carry you downstream. You let the current help you, and you cut diagonally across the current, letting the river take you downstream, and you have very little risk of drowning compared to the amount of energy you have to expend as an athlete. So again, our argument is don't fight human nature. Work with it. Try to understand children as unique human beings. Try to get them into a partnership with you. And of course, you want to housebreak them. You want to teach them not to bite. You want to teach them not to be mean to each other. You want to model the behavior that you expect from them. And you need to be incredibly consistent. So what would I recommend if I were the principal of a public high school? I would say find the funds and start an early childhood program and teach your kids. I don't know whether you're running a school that's 9th to 12th grade in the United States, or maybe you've got one of those great schools that goes from early adolescence, 7th grade through 12th grade, which we happen to think was a great model once upon a time. But the younger you teach kids, teenagers, how to be with little children, how to work with them, how to change their diapers, how to talk to them, how to meet their needs and enjoy them, bear witness to their changes, and model the behavior. Kind of step out of your teenage fantasy world and kind of be present with a small child and be better than yourself. You're training kids to be the parents of the future. And I just think teaching kids to cook and teaching kids how to work with young children and appreciate them for what they are is one of the best things we can do for our societies and our schools.
Man, you shared some really good nuggets in that, and I want to take a couple of those and kind of just comment on those. I'd never heard somebody put it the way you did for the paying, like people who are teaching, how people that are teaching younger kids and students and children are not getting paid as much, and they're looked down upon typically, like, oh, you work at a preschool, or oh, you work with like little kids. When they go, oh, this person's teaching calculus, trigonometry, and they're like, wow, that's like crazy. I've never heard it put that way, but I see that when we talk about how important, if you, obviously everybody agrees with that, which I agree with that. I think we can prove that of how valuable those first 5-6 years are. I've never heard that put before. So I absolutely love that. And I do agree. And I remember if you see little kids and they're all running around going crazy and you're like, wow, like to be with that all day long, like 20 of them in a classroom, like that that does take a special person. I've said that multiple times, and it's impressive.
I would suggest it doesn't take a special person at all. If you know what you're doing. In America, we have a business called 𝐀𝐸𝐿𝐿. And 𝐀𝐸𝐿𝐿, for those of you who are listening who have been to one, you know that that's a place of chaos. I mean, it's just craziness. It's loud, it's distracting, kids behave badly. Same thing, taking them to Disney World or an amusement park or a country fair. Children tend to very quickly become overstimulated, overwhelmed. You set up a school like that. I don't care whether you're running a high school or an elementary school or an early childhood school. You're setting kids up for failure. There'll be some kids that'll blossom. But if you create an environment where 20 kids, 30 kids, 40 kids, there are schools around the world where, because of the economics, 50 kids, 60 kids in a classroom. If you run it in a Montessori way, instead of a teacher at the front of the room, using rewards and punishment and humiliation to try to make the kids look at me, do what I tell you, but instead create the equivalent of a prepared environment for learning. Now, some of you may know the term maker's space, and you may think of a large room that has all kinds of tools for creating art projects and STEM projects and maybe woodworking or robotics or whatever. But it typically looks a lot like a children's museum with lots of different interest areas, things kids could choose to do. And they don't need to be told, Mitchell, come with me. I want you to do this now. Instead, what you've done is created a safe space where children can either be drawn to something just because they see it and they're curious, or their friend is over there doing it. And if you very deliberately create an atmosphere of quiet and calm, instead of assuming that yelling and pushing and crying is the norm, and where you're speaking to them with kindness and calmness and respect, which doesn't mean that a child is about to bite another child, should be spoken to in that kind of sort of silly, now don't bite your friend. Yeah, you do need to say to them, you need to stop that now. Or you put yourself in between them and say, look at them in the eye, drop down to their eye level and say, no, I can't let you do that. But treat them with respect in the same way that if you were in my home and you were about to break a very precious piece of china that I have, I would say something to you like, Mitchell, please, that's very valuable to me. Would you put that down? But I wouldn't say to you, Mitchell, God darn it, put it down, you fool. In other words, you don't create harm to the relationship. And children are very sensitive to the way they're treated and respected. The more you treat them with kindness, the more consistent you are, the more you're willing to listen to what they have to say, the more they're likely to be willing to listen to you. I call that partnership.
And I agree, and I love that. And we like doing with our son Milo is we'll give him options instead of saying, which I think this is American culture too. Like have these natural sayings where we'll be like, all right, are you ready for bed? And be like, no, I'm not ready for bed. Oh, well, it is bedtime, so you're going to bed. Instead of doing that question that you already know the answer to, you would say, hey, it's time for bed. Would you like to walk, or would you like me to carry you to bed? And giving him at least the ability to have like a control over one of those moments. And I feel like now sometimes it doesn't work. He's like, no, I don't want to do any of it. But we're giving him options almost all the time of like, would you rather do this or this? And I really like that. I love the part too that you shared about the following the child, which is obviously big thing with Montessori. And what I love is when Milo will find something or attach to something, he's super hyper focused on it, is to go off of that with him. So like he just the other day he pointed at something and he was like, "What's that?" And we were in a hurry, and I was like, well, that's something. Well, what is that? And I was like, So I took the time to be like, I think it was something like some type of golly, what was it? Was it bug or something? And I was like, well, that's this, and it's gonna. And we kind of just dove into it because he's super curious. Instead of going later, 2 weeks later, Milo, I'm going to teach you about this bug. He's like, I don't want to learn about the bug right now. And so he's not going to remember it. He's going to have a horrible he's going to be like, well, I don't remember it, and I have a bad experience now with it because you're forcing it on me. And I feel like if the schools were taking that approach, we would see a huge difference in the type of education. But I know they're not all set up for that. So I guess maybe a flip question for you, Tim. So if a student, let's say, there's certain things, of course, they just need to learn, as they're growing. If they truly just never want to learn that and dive into it, what is the Montessori approach actually for that? If they're like, I don't want to learn math, or I don't want to learn how to count, or read. What is the approach for that if a child does that?
Well, I mean, every kid's a little different. They all have their own motivations, and it's usually not as black and white and simple as that. But the most typical is to say, I hear what you're saying, and, this is really not an option because, in our culture, you need to know math. I can tell you why you need to know math, but frankly, it's really not a negotiable issue.
Oh. And then they say that if they, because I know Montessori with discipline is also a little bit different too. Like, what would you suggest if a kid truly is like, well, I don't want to learn it, I don't like it? Do you get like a special tutor that comes in and tries to help them, or what is that next approach? Now, I haven't ran into this yet, but I have a 3.5-year-old, so hopefully we're good. But what would you do?
Well, the first thing in Montessori is we really want to get kids into school, and I do mean school, not preschool, no later than the age of 3. And anyone who's listening, if you're a high school principal like I was for many years, I'm telling you, somehow or another, you need to connect to your school an early childhood center. Because if you want to produce the kind of kids you want at 14, you don't wait until 12. You do it the earlier, the better. Those kids are surrounded by mathematics. They're surrounded by language. They're surrounded by science, history, geography, all kinds of things. But it's all designed to be enticing and seductive and clear. You might think of it as toys, but it's not toys the way Americans know it. But somebody said to a Montessori school child, this is someone in the 1920s in London, went to a Montessori school as a reporter, and he said to a child who he met as he was entering the school, "Is this your school?" And the little child says, "No, sir, but I work here." As he went through the school after he was admitted through the office, he went up to a couple little girls and he said, "Is it true that Montessori you can do whatever you want?" The little girls looked, and they were 3 or 4 years old, and they said, "Well, I don't know about that, sir. I can tell you my friends and I like what we do." So that whole idea of a house where, what kid doesn't want to go to Disneyland? If you can create an environment that is designed to follow the child, it's designed to make things very, very clear and concrete and seductive. And I know that you've seen Montessori schools, and your child may or may not yet be picking up on math, because quite often at 3, they're more focused on what we call practical life skills and sensorial skills and movement. So you might be more focused on polishing silver or washing a table or working on the plants or who knows what. And he's developing a lot of skills, usually order, concentration, independence, eye-hand coordination, language development and vocabulary. And they're learning things that are really amazing, like, "Dad, this is a trispatulate leaf," or "Mom, this is a curvilinear triangle," or "this is a sphere." And so people are always saying, where are these kids learning this stuff? But they're exposed to children who are 3, 4, and 5 years of age. And very quickly, they will start seeing kids doing things that are mathematics. And normally, the way schools teach kids mathematics is really boring and it's abstract and they don't understand it. It's like algebra. The average person doesn't really understand fractions or algebra or long division. They do it, they can solve a problem, but they don't really understand it. And they can't really teach it to someone else other than say, well, do this and then do that. They don't know what it's doing. Now, by the way, I'm a great believer in a kid knowing how to do it in their head and being able to use a piece of paper only. But when you make it three-dimensional, if you think about mathematics, if all you use is a bunch of marbles and say 1 marble, 2 marbles, 3 marbles, once you get to about 5 marbles, the average little kid doesn't really understand what they're looking at because it just looks like a lot. But if you begin to teach them, in America, we use the decimal system. If you teach them the idea of units, tens, units of 100, and units of 1,000, and you begin to help them to understand the concept of numeration, not just by counting. There's a thing called the spindle box where they have these little rods of wood, and there are compartments that are labeled 0 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4. And they put, 0 spindles is nothing. It's empty. 0 is nothing. It's alone. There's nothing there. 1 gets 1 spindle. And then they'll typically, by the way, tie a green bow around the set of 2. So here 2 is a unit of 2 in my hand. And now I'll tie a green bow, and green, by the way, represents units. So a unit of 1,000 would be color-coded green. A unit of 1,000,000 would be color-coded green. So a unit is green. And it's just arbitrary. It could just as easily be chartreuse. But all over the world, in Montessori schools, we use a color coding system. So what they traditionally will do is they'll get 2. They have a basket of these spindles, and they'll get 2. And they could just put them into the 2 compartment. It's labeled 2, put 2, put 1 in the 1, put 3 in the 3. Or they can tie them together and make a bundle of 3 and tie the bow, and they're practicing bow tying at the same time. Now, you could use a rubber band, which is a different thing. I like bow tying. It's a better, I'm a sailor. I'm a great believer. Teach these kids knots at an early age. Teach them how to do knots they can untie. So anyway, you can do it that way, but it's much more clear to a really young child if you show numeration linearly. So think of a yardstick. So in the metric system, we work in meters, which is about 3 feet long. And it's divided up into tenths or decimeters. So 10 centimeters is called a decimeter. And so what you get is a meter stick, and every 10 centimeters in length, this is called the red and blue rods, by the way, if those of you know Montessori. So every 10 rods, you just have an alternating color. Happen to use red and blue. There's no particular reason. It just shows the kid visually. But there's one rod that is 1 decimeter long. And there's another one that's twice as long, 2 decimeters, or 20 centimeters long. There's another one that's 3 centimeters. So when you look at this, you put the 10 of them together, it forms a stair. You can literally see from the 10 decimeters or 1 meter rod all the way down to the 1. And you can also take the 1 rod and put it next to the 2 rod, and now you got a 3 rod. So when you think of math starting as something that's linear, it's easier to understand when it's just 1-to-1 correspondence counting. We do all kinds of things like that. We teach kids, you probably have seen the golden beads of Montessori, where you have little glass beads, which I suppose they could swallow, but they don't. At least very rarely do I ever see a child do anything silly. That's one of the things I appreciate about running Montessori schools. We just normally don't have fights or nonsense going on. But you teach them, this is a unit. This is 2 units, 2 individual beads. There's 3. This is 3. And they're just 3 discrete individual beads. This is 10. When we get to 10, we wire them. They're wired together, and they're in a rod, a little line of 10. And you've probably seen 10 rods. And so we say, okay, this is a unit of 10. This is 2 tens, 3 tens, 4 tens. How many tens would you like to have, Mitchell, in your number? 5? Would you count 5 out of the bank? And there's a bank, a collection. Would you like 5 in your number? Great. We call that 50. 5 tens is 50. 5 tenths. And we have, how many units would you like? 3. Okay, so we have 5 tens. Here they are, 5 10 rods, and 3 units. That's 5 tens, 3 units. We call that 53. Can you say that? What number would you like to build next? Would you like to add these numbers together? Oh, we reached 11. Now we need to exchange 10 of them, 10 tens, for the next biggest, which is 100. 100 is made up of 10 tens. Anyway, when you start doing this with kids 3, 4, and 5, by the time they're 6, they're thinking abstractly. And we do all kinds of things. So again, the earlier you start and the more concrete you start and the more you make it fun, instead of just memorization, and the more they see a practical application, like to make this cake mix, you need to take this measuring cup and get 3 cups of water and fill it right up to this line and put it into this bowl. And now you need to get 2 cups of the flour and put that in. So they're learning. They're seeing, practical application.
And it's the best way to learn because it's something that they're going to remember. I know that's how I learned growing up. I was actually homeschooled my whole life. So my mom did very, very hands-on stuff. I mean, I remember cooking with her at 2 years old, 3 years old, and she wasn't doing she didn't know she was doing Montessori. I kind of joke with her because she didn't even know what that was, and I was like, well, you were kind of doing that without knowing it because we were so hands-on with applicable things that we were learning, but we didn't have any of the materials. And then my son loves cooking with me. So it's all the applicable life application things is so valuable and they don't lose it and they love it. I mean, you mentioned that about the 3-year-olds, their age right now, they want to contribute. They want to be a part of it and see what's the bigger picture kind of in this, what we're living. And you can see it, you can feel it. So I don't know. I feel like our culture doesn't give kids enough credit and they can do a lot and they're very smart and they are hungry to learn. So I feel like Montessori is a good way to get that foundation built in them. So
if I may, let me just add 1 or 2 other things here. First is Montessori was many things. She's a person. It's a name. She never copyrighted it, so anybody can do whatever they want to call it Montessori. Number 2, she didn't invent anything. This is stuff that's been around for a long time. So it's really important to know that Montessori was a scientist, and what she was focused on was trying to figure out how kids learn best. The third thing is the Montessori materials and the Montessori lessons. They're basically, again, very little of it is unique to Montessori, although there's a lot of junk out there that calls itself Montessori, but there is a very specific sequence of tools that we normally teach teachers to use in Montessori, and it's got several characteristics. Number 1, it's beautiful. It's not junk. Number 2, it's designed to be seductive. It's intended to be so gorgeous. Literally, if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, you'll find that a full set of Montessori materials is on display as examples of some of the most beautiful manufactured artwork out there, just as a beautiful Ferrari might be considered a work of art. Number 4, there's a very specific sequence, and that sequence is important because it's going from the very simple to the more and more complex, and from the very three-dimensional and concrete to the increasingly abstract. And there's a very specific reason why we do it. Now, anyone can invent anything else and throw it in, but quite often they're really wasting their time because it's all been done before. And if you just follow the prepared system, you tend to get better results. There's a logic to it. And fifthly, most people don't really know most of the Montessori curriculum. They know a tiny fraction that they've seen on YouTube, and they don't realize how vast it really is. And that's what Montessori teacher training does over the 1.5 to 3 years of training that you go through after you get your bachelor's. So Montessori teachers are taught a lot. part of it is the curriculum. Part of it is the way the brain develops and how to talk to children, and how to observe children, and how to know how they're really thinking, how they're getting to that answer, and how to create that atmosphere where children really want to cooperate, which doesn't mean they always want to do what you want to do when you want to do it, but you get this general environment of calmness and peacefulness in your family or in your homeschool or in this classroom of 20, 30, 40, 50 children, multi-age children, with the youngest mostly being stimulated by the older. And this works not only with infants and toddlers and 3 to 6 year olds, it works with elementary age children, works with middle school children, works with high school. And the whole idea that someone is a science teacher or a chemistry teacher. I remember this one young woman that I met in a Montessori high school who was in her first year, hadn't taken training, and said to me, I can't wait to get out of this school. I want to go work for the public schools, and I want to teach 5 sections of Bio 1 and only have 1 prep to do a year, and that's it. I'm going to teach the same thing year after year after year. And that whole idea of a pacing guide of I'm going to teach the same lesson to the whole class at the same time, and it's up to them to learn it. It's not my job to help them to learn it. It's their job to learn it. Very different mindset from Montessori, which is more like the Asian philosophy of medicine. I'm here to help you stay well, and you stop paying me if you're sick. And my job is to help you regain wellness. That's what you pay me for. It's a very different mindset. And instead of comparing kids one against another, what we do is celebrate where each child is at. And what we're trying to do is get each one of them to become the very best thinker, artist, inventor, innovator that we possibly can. We're trying to bring the best out of each individual human being.
Man, there's some gold stuff in here, Tim, and some good nuggets. So I would like to ask you, kind of like as we look to wrap it up, I would love to ask you, this might be a long answer, which is fine with me, is if you were to share one piece of advice with just school leaders in general, so not specifically Montessori, not public school, just like if you were to share just like a piece of advice to educators listening, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh my gosh.
It could be a couple if you can't get it down to one.
Alfie Kahn wrote an essay some years ago that you can look up online. And I think it was the back to school speech from a principal that we wish we would hear. I highly recommend anyone who can look it up and just read it. It's not Montessori, it's just common sense. I think the bottom line is stop thinking of a school as a factory. Stop thinking of it as a prison. Stop thinking of these kids as people who, if you turn your back on them, they're going to knife each other, or they're going to bring in a gun, or they're going to do whatever. And that doesn't mean there isn't violence in the world. There is. If you want to make a difference, remember you're teaching human beings. You're teaching children. If you want to get somewhere, stop focusing on the state tests and on trying to make everyone else happy and trying to avoid controversy because some parents can be offended for one reason or the other. Instead, try to listen. Try to get people talking with each other. Education is really a conversation among people. The word educate doesn't mean to teach. It means to draw forth. Educare is to bring out. And I think the whole idea of creating a community of learning, which doesn't mean that you don't have to teach Physics 1 or the reading series, but whatever you can do to get kids to feel like they're not just simply pawns on a chessboard being moved around by other people with bells going off and loudspeakers going off telling them to report to the office, or fire drills or active shooter drills or whatever, but instead try to create a community as best you can, a partnership between adults and children. And yeah, there's stuff that kids have to learn. There's always a curriculum that in every country at every period of time, kids are expected to know, and it changes. I mean, we don't know what skills today's children are going to need in 10 years. I mean, artificial intelligence ought to be a good example of how mind-blowing this stuff can be. We just don't know what people will do to earn a living in 20 years. What we do know is what they need to be able to do is feel that they belong, feel that they matter, feel that the people around them matter, feel that they have obligations and responsibilities to each other, not just privilege, and that kindness and respect are not just earned, they are something we give because human beings are endowed with it at birth. They deserve to be treated with kindness and respect. Try to create a culture of continuous learning, of continuous conversation, of continuous questioning. And obviously, we don't want to indoctrinate kids. Kids don't like to be indoctrinated, whether it's liberal, conservative, religious, whatever. Most kids don't go for that. What they want is to explore ideas and to feel that it's safe to question or to express an opinion, which they may not really even believe. They may just be trying it on for size. But to teach them how to behave with respect and kindness to one another and to adults, because adults matter too. So we create a community, a circle of equals would be my typical way of describing it. Partnership.
Love it. Love it. Well, any final thoughts, Tim, before we wrap up today's episode? It's been awesome, but any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my thought is you asked me to come because, I'm a Montessori educator and teacher educator and so forth. And I guess what I'd want people to know is if you're already involved with Montessori, great. If Montessori seems like it's a wacky, chaotic, you don't know what the heck it is, or you think it's a religion or a cult or a franchise or whatever, you're wrong. What it is a worldwide movement that's actually the single largest movement of educators that's a cross-section or a partnership with neurobiologists, psychologists, anthropologists, brain scientists, educators, and all we're trying to do is understand how human beings go from infancy to adulthood, what works best. We know kids learn in lots of ways. We know that all kinds of schools work for different kids. We're not suggesting that we have the one right answer. What we are suggesting is every single human being is a universe of one. And the best schools really focus not just on what needs to be learned, but on the people who are engaged in the process of facilitating learning and actually trying to learn something. And the more you get people working and talking together, the better. Montessori is the largest non-government owned system of education in the world. And most people don't know that. And it's not only for the rich, it's not for any one group. It can be used with infants through university. There are people using it with dementia patients right now. It's a way of living. It's a way of organizing processes. And certainly the process called learning, school, it's a marvelous process. Whether you're Montessori trained or not, you probably could learn a lot if you took the time to try to unpack it and figure out what makes this work and figure out what parts of it can you put into place in your classroom or your school.
Awesome. Well, Tim, you've been doing this a long time, my friend. So I thank you for all your years of just learning Montessori, pouring into schools and teachers and people who are families and parents who are wanting to raise up their children. And I just want to say thank you for that. And thank you, of course, for just taking time out of your day. I know we've talked, this has been a good one. We've talked over my typical average, which I love because it was a good conversation. So I appreciate you just taking time out of your day. And I'd love to be just a resource to you if you ever have anybody you meet, that you think would be a good guest to share with our audience, that you'd connect them over here. We'd love to give them an interview because, again, my family loves Montessori. So I appreciate it very much. And always please stay in touch, my friend.
Thanks. It was my privilege. Thanks, Mike. Mitchell.
Well, another huge shout out and a thank you to Tim for taking time and being on the podcast today. I love what he's doing. I love how much they're helping Montessori schools, and I'm just wishing them nothing but the best as they continue to pour in to more and more Montessori schools across the country. And if you're a school, of course, that's listening to this and you're needing help to grow or connect better with your families, I would love you to connect with us. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can find us online, schoolsuccessmakers.com. There's some resources on there. I'd love you guys to check out schoolsuccessmakers.com, or connect with us on Facebook. You can personally in this group, so I'd love to see you in there. It's School Success Makers, private group just for school leaders. So go in there and connect in there. I'd love to see you. And of course, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, you can find out more about us online and reach out to us that way on our website. And I'd just love to connect with you, learn about your school, learn about what's going on. And if you are also possibly a great candidate for a podcast, we'd love to hear that as well. If it's you wanting to be interviewed, or if you know some great people, you're like, man, they should be interviewing this person, I would love to hear about those as well. We're super open to feedback on different people in education that should be interviewed. So we love doing this. We love being a resource for you. So if you have any ideas, again, please share those with us. And as always, we'll be back here next week with another amazing guest as usual on the School Success Podcast. We'll see you then.